Good morning, and first of all, I would love to thank ReversingLabs and the conference organizers for inviting me to join the conference. I'm particularly excited to present the topic of the evolution of cybercrime intent and how to hunt using YARA for malware developers. One of my passion is tracking one of the most sophisticated threats and how to use and enable tools such as YARA for such purposes. And the purpose of my talk is to also dive deeper and to lay out the foundation groundwork of what the current landscape is as we see it from our perspective day in and day out. The talk outline will be focused on 6 or 5 rather specific topics. We'll talk about the evolution of criminal intent. We'll discuss what's the current situation on the sophisticated cybercrime landscape, who the groups are, how do they operate, what's the current perspective and what the retrospective on how these groups operated. We also talk about how the groups essentially the new, or rather the modus operandi is to hunt for high value targets. We also talk about the advanced persistent threat groups and approach, including ransomware. And specifically, we'll dive deeper into the TrickBot and how the TrickBot groups works very closely with the group we call Lazarus, which is supposedly the North Korean state-sponsored group. We also talk about the emergence of ransom hacks, the idea of not only to encrypt and essentially install a malware on the systems, but also to use the media and public pressure to comply with extortions. And then we'll talk about specific ideas around the YARA hunting for, essentially hunting for crypto implementations. I think in future, as we see it, YARA hunting for crypto implementations would be the key. And the reason why it's because it's, as we like to say, we like to track humans. And humans, they write malware. And YARA allows us the flexibility and abilities to hunt for such snippets of the code that can be useful in future. And we'll talk about the key takeaways. And specifically for the YARA, we'll focus on 2 use cases. We'll talk about how to use YARA signature to build full end-to-end custom static analyzer and unpacker for Trigbot Crypter, been used since 2019. And we'll also talk about the network ransomware, how it can use for hunting purposes, and how can identify the code that can be used for such purposes. So who am I? My name is Vitali Kremez. Thank you, Robert, for introducing me. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have my own blog, but also quite a few times my name appeared in a few malware samples. So I'm pretty active on Twitter. Feel free to follow me as well. At the end of my talk, I also have a kind of small surprise and invitations for some of the threat hunters to join some of our efforts as we track. But essentially, I worked in the US government for many years, focused on the most sophisticated and complex cyber threats. Since then, I joined the private sector. I led quite a few researcher teams and companies through that, my experience. And yeah, this is me. So one of the key things I wanted to highlight part of the talk is the Cybercrime Trends 2020, and essentially focused on how the sophisticated criminal enterprises, such as Trigbot, Quagbot, and threat actor TA505, how they focused on parsing and identifying high-value targets. We also call them HVT. We also discussed the trends where we've seen in our landscape, which is kind of important to the attribution of some of our malware activities and tracking, how the cybercrime kind of meets advanced persistent threat groups with the focus on the Trigbot and Lazarus connection. We also discussed the ransom hacks. It's the approach of when we've seen with the Maze ransomware group and REVO, whenever they encrypt the machines, they also use the publicity surrounding these breaches to amplify and coerce the victims to pay them up, basically. We also have seen that on the landscape, on the cybercrime perspective, that the big botnet data collectors, they need flexible solutions to identify high-value targets. So the criminal groups are working tirelessly to identify which machines are the most value for them. They're not longer interested in useless infections. They actually don't really care about private infections, or rather not corporate networks. So they really focused on some of the networks with high-value targets. Of course, they can still squeeze value, dollar and pounds and euros from those bots, but the key focus on those groups and with their method of operation is just to focus on the most sophisticated, I guess, attacks including ransomware, as we've seen. And just going back to the premise and why it's so important for us to track cybercrime groups, it's the kind of the key figure across the landscape and the key person who inspired so many botnet groups and so many ransomware groups was Slavic. Slavic was also known as a Russian national, Yevgeny Mikhailovich Bogachev, who's still one of the most wanted criminals. There's still a $3 million award, so if you can find him, of course you can grab this award. But he essentially piloted the peer-to-peer Zeus group, which became known to be Business Club. And why it's so important for you to know that the Business Club emerged, because this is the first time they introduced their first real ransomware as it was. And the practice of using the bots, essentially the infected machines for kind of highly scalable ransomware solution. So the key figure across the cybercrime landscape was Slavic. And the key focus on why he's so important was for us to track, because he piloted some of the most interesting and most sophisticated groups. Basically, the major groups that are active now, including Trigbot and Dridex, were former customers of his Business Club. And because they were customers, they learned the practices and the business mechanics surrounding the breaches and ransomware and banking attacks. The key focus and the idea of the current 2020 attacks is the hunting for high-value targets and network parsing. And the idea that surrounding the breaches we've seen, the commonality is that there was automation attack where we've seen the malware deployment, and we've seen that, for example, Emotet as a loader has been used quite a bit, the deploying Trigbot banking malware. And since then, when the criminals groups realizes and runs the specific network record parser and pings back to server, they would deploy a Ryuk ransomware, commonly with a PowerShell Empire, which is basically executing a back connect module and executing essentially a session on the machines. So they realized that the idea is just to squeeze more value. And the ransomware becomes like a perfect scenario where in the light of the essentially becoming more difficult for them to monetize some of the banking accounts. But it's so easy to use ransomware for such purposes, and it scales and it yields lots of benefit. And the idea is just for them is just to look at their mega botnet breach lake and identify what the targets suitable for such infections. And one of the kind of key examples we've seen with the Trigbot, essentially in Ryuk ransomware, Ryuk is almost exclusively used by Trigbot in all the infections. It's the Cloud Jumper case, when we've seen a $5 billion extortion amounts used. And this is just an example of where the group requested 600,000 Bitcoins. When you remember, there was a case when Ryuk affected LA Times, and the only reason they were so successful with LA Times intrusion is because they were able to infect the whole Cloud Jumper network, which was a customer of LA Times. This is kind of an interesting example. What we've seen that the profits and the benefits of multi-million intrusions from ransomware are so much more profitable than just banking purposes. And this is the shift in a way that the criminals think. They realize that let's focus on high-value targets and ransom them, including the human component. That we've seen that the emergence of skill sets of human network exploitation actors using Cobalt Strike, for example, or Metasploit frameworks. This is another interesting example, what we've seen with the Doppelpaymer ransomware, with the Pamex intrusion, where they requested 565 Bitcoins extortion with the victim node via portal link on Tor. It's also a very interesting use case. We've seen that Doppelpaymer has recently moved into the same model where they leak victim information as well. But this is the kind of automated decryptor, or rather debugger output related to the penetration. You've seen that the network is very targeted, has its own portal ID. So we know that the criminal has been lurking in the network for quite a while before deploying this. It was not a spray and pray attack, but rather very focused and very targeted. And that's the flavor of the cybercrime we see now. It's very focused and targeted. Also, we've seen that the Clap ransomware attack, for example, another good example of the cybercrime landscape perspective. This is the group that linked to the threat actor TA505. This is one of the ransomware operations they have. They usually deploy Clap ransomware via TinyMet, which is TinyMet Interpreter open source. offensive toolkit. And this is an example when they essentially attacked Rowan University Hospital in France. Still very targeted and very interesting approach where they see that lots of benefit from extorting the high value and large networks. And the idea behind some of the breaches and some of the infrastructures outside of even the direct botnet sales, we've seen that the access to corporate networks becomes a commodity and also becomes access as a service, where multiple criminal groups offer access is procured via, for example, brute force and remote desktop protocols, which were externally available, or even brute force and Active Directory, which was available externally as well. And through compromising RDPs, for example, or botnets, they oftentimes sell them on dark web, as an example, or allow for specific purposes to search for data. But some groups, for example, one of the criminal group known as, of course, as REvil, use the services of another proxy called Sheriff to buy accesses that for specific for high value large networks. So there's a still thriving and rich offers related to the sales and monetizing the corporate breaches that exist. Another interesting nexus we've seen in one of our largest discoveries of 2019 with the team at Sentinel Labs was that we identified the Trigbot and Lazarus angle. Part of the angle when we've seen as we normally analyze the Trigbot malware and we look closely for the new modules deployed. However, there's something interesting was occurring. There was a bot called Anchor, and Anchor was a kind of, I would say, the fork of Trigbot. It's related to the Trigbot original source code, but it's quite different, and it's been used on some of the interesting targets. And we've seen through the Anchor bot that we've seen that Trigbot group was moving to the targeted and kind of APT approach. We've seen that they're pursuing point of sale machines. We've seen them doing reconnaissance, deep reconnaissance related to payment systems and additional services available on those networks. And we also have seen the hallmark and the trademark malware related to the Lazarus group, which was called Power Tonguebot. And this framework, which is Anchor, becomes more like a framework rather than the actual bot. It also has specific deinstallers and tools meant to scrub evidence of intrusion, which is very interesting. And that means that the group was interested not only to use the Trigbot infections for commodity, even ransomware purposes, but also dive into the APT world, I would say, and kind of sell some of the access to different groups and work with them. This was a very pivotal moment. And this was the one in a lifetime kind of discovery when we were the first ever to see the exact connection between the Trigbot group and the North Korean Lazarus execution. This was the task command that was issued to the bot with download a very specific PowerShell script, which is also known as Power Tonguebot, which was a hallmark of the Lazarus group operation. And you can see here the chain that led to that through the server, which is also very interesting. And the key connection, what was the to Lazarus? I actually published a blog quite some time ago, which was specifically related to the Chilean Red Bank intrusion. When the Chilean Red Bank faced with the Lazarus North Korean group infection, they were able to stop the infections from spreading to the corporate and financial gateways. But however, through that infections, we learned quite a bit of TTPs, tactic, techniques, and procedures. We learned that the IOC related to the code was the ecom box store script. There were two scripts that were deployed through ecom box store. One was a get PSV, as you can see in the chain, and was the cget PSV. And it also was decoded. Specific script was decoded as and hidden as the job application. Essentially, they were alluring the developers inside the Chilean Red Bank to install the malware and using them as a pivot, or rather ground network for the Lazarus installation. But it also was enabled as well through the Trigbot installation that we've seen, which is very interesting. Another big goal and another big idea we've seen is that the ransomware groups becoming essentially ransom hacks. But this is a prime example of the Maze ransomware group. When I was looking into earlier today, the Maze group became the new, I would say, phenomenon. They have been adopting some of the methods other groups have been using before, including the publicizing breaches and using, like, for example, media to amplify extortions. And this is a portal where they essentially compromise and lock or encrypt networks. But even outside of that, what they do is, if the victim doesn't comply or doesn't pay them up, they would just put their information there on the website and force them to comply. This is a very interesting world where they also started to realize that the company faced so much public pressure and scrutiny and so much investment attention. So they will be very interested to essentially to collaborate with them in many cases. And this is kind of an example of them not only breaching, essentially deploying ransomware on the networks, but also using the data from the human interactive exploitation attacks to leak and force them and coerce them to force their hands and force their payments. Another interesting aspect of the kind of the big shift that the group called REVEL, which is another very popular and very active, one of the most interesting groups currently, that has a very sophisticated private network exploitation team of hackers that weaponizing essentially GDPR. They realize that GDPR affects how companies behave externally, and they realize that, for example, in the breach of Cyrus-1 data center, that they claim that if they do not comply, that GDPR would affect them. So there is a lot of interesting calculus and rationalization behind some of the criminal minds we've seen. This is kind of an interesting perspective on what the new challenges we see in our landscape, that the ransomware do become breaches. You cannot disregard ransomware infections and simple data disruptions events, but it also becomes data exfiltration. And this is the new normal of our operations. And I want to move into the hunting using YARA from our developer cryptologic implementations. So we will take a use case of few samples related to the group called Trigbot, which is, of course, one of the groups linked to the APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Group activity. And we'll also take a look at another sample called Netwalker, which is linked to one of the ransom hacks. Netwalker became known during the COVID times, actually, for attacking healthcare institutions, which was a big ethical violation, even inside of some of the most sophisticated groups, where they essentially decided to hold them for ransom. And this is another interesting angle to that. The idea behind hunting for YARA and the way I think of hunting for YARA in the future is that, again, malware developers, they operate as essentially as legitimate software developers. They try to automate their work and reduce the time they spend on repetitive tasks whenever possible. It also means that they create and reuse code across their malware. Even myself, I oftentimes do not rewrite this same routine twice. I oftentimes copy code that I did before. So, and it also enables us from the malware hunting perspective to take a full advantage of that, of the malware development cycles. And one of the key things that I want to focus on as part of the talk is hunting for crypto routines or crypto implementations, cryptographical implementations across malware samples. And the key payoff across focusing essentially, you're using the malware analysis and malware unpacking as a way forward, is just to detect such activity and create really reliable, long-standing rules that can survive through malware families, because they're focused on the cryptographic implementations which oftentimes harder for criminals to change or adapt, which goes beyond simple code reuse that usually normally can be used for YARA hunting. And I do strongly believe that combinations of string matching in a YARA signature, as well as the code, that's the key, that's the way forward. One of the interesting aspects, or rather interesting examples, as I was thinking about the talk itself, it's the Trigbot Crypter. So Trigbot has its own layer that was being introduced since May 2019. This is kind of an example of a tweet. They have a very own private crypter, and the private crypter has very distinct functions, including virtual, ALAC, X, NUMA, and many others. So it has a different, unique flavor of how they operate. This is kind of an example of one of the discoveries related to the early crypters that have been introduced by Trigbot. But another aspect that they have not changed majorly, the core code itself, they have adapted some of the and hidden some of the layers through their ways, through their means and ways as they were thinking about how they can hide the functionality and avoid detections, making it FUD, what it means full undetectable. But the key functionality remained the same. And the latest version that utilizes this specific, in this case, they use RC4, which is a known cryptographic algorithm, with a small twist, which is an interesting twist because it allows us to understand what the malware developer perspective was and what they were trying to achieve. They essentially introduced a small change within the RC4 cryptographical algorithm where they, instead of like looking for 255, they checked the different length of the RC4, which allowed us to create a simple unpacker while using YARA to hunt for specifically for RC4 implementation that I'll link to Trigbot. And Trigbot has its own very unique crypting service. And one of the interesting insights that the specific crypto server used by Trigbot helped us connect Trigbot, Emotet, and Ryuk itself, just because the unique crypto used. And this is the focus. This also was released in our blog called Zero to Auto, where we helped and analyze and use YARA Signature as a way to embed it in scripts, of course, for automated static unpacking, and as well as for proactive hunting. So take a look as well. And the idea behind the custom RC4 was that it was using the, as you can see, S-box size 184. And it's very unique because normally when you look at the RC4 routine was that the X-box is usually 255. And it was a deviation from a normal RC4 routine. So that means that instead of, or rather breaking custom or other automated unpacking of default RC4 routines, the Trigbot group decided to slightly change the code, specifically related to the S-box routine, and just changing the length allow them to break some of the automation that some sandboxes were using to unpack Trigbot. And of course, it was using the ROR13 API hash specific to virtual alloc EX NUMA, which is also the signature for us for quite a while. That's an interesting and very helpful example how you can use YARA to build your own static unpacker. And the idea behind everything else we do is just to use the YARA as the pivot for hunting and building the tooling using YARA. This is an example in our blog when we talk with actually Jason, who is one of our instructors of our course, when we teach students how to write YARA signatures reliably. You can see here that we focus on a very specific aspect. So we are trying to signature on the S-box size. The S-box size is important because it's unique to Trigbot. It's not unique to any RC4 implementations, which are by default, but it's very unique to Trigbot on its own. But it's also unique in a way, the sequence of some of the bytes it was using earlier to copy essentially the key to RC4. And combinations of those two cryptographical algorithms will allow you to search for and identify reliably the crypter and artifacts related to the Trigbot loader, crypter, which is very interesting. And the idea behind everything what we do is to use some of the YARA and capabilities to scan and use a tool. Part of the blog, we released a full script that allows analysts and hunters to search for Trigbot, but also to automatically unpack. Oftentimes, it's not the easiest job to write static automated unpackers because the crypto can change, or rather the cryptors can change quickly. However, this is an example how any analyst can take a look and use and essentially distinguish in the code the RC4 routine and using the custom S-box size and key and extract and write their own static unpackers. So please take a look. And this is an example of how the end-to-end static unpacker you can deploy in your hunting efforts using YARA. Another example I want to talk about is that the networker ransomware. So networker ransomware has very specific also crypto, not too specific as it's Trigbot, but it's also a good helpful example how you can use YARA signature for both signaturing for unique crypto sequences within networker ransomware, and also use it for hunting within the various tools and various mining options, and essentially hunting for additional samples. And then once you identify the samples, you can automatically unpack and identify new victims. As has been noted earlier, that the cybercrime trends have changed. The cybercrime trends are no longer spray and pray approach. They're very focused. And in cases with the networker, they specifically name the victims in their ransom notes, as you can see through our hunting efforts. And this is kind of an interesting example how the crypto YARA can help you with identifying the new samples related to network ransomware. As you can see at the code itself, and also there's a blog, feel free to reference. We published the full analysis related to how to write networker ransomware decryptor, and of course using some of the interesting constant strings related to, in this example, with salsa 20 or cha-cha 20 encryption and the D-word value, which was actually appeared to be quite unique across the networker samples. And whenever you look into the malware, try and identify what would be the interesting aspects for you to signature from the code reuse perspective, I always try to focus on the cryptographic algorithms or focus on specific routines that are unique to the malware families that we analyze. In many cases, those are the best, in my opinion, YARA candidates you can use and then test it across the malware samples. And this is what the unique strings that came up to us, which you see here, and expand 32-byte expand, which is also unique. And when we use this, for example, as a content or some ways to search for, we quickly identify that unique sequences exist only across the networker ransomware samples and allow us to identify, for example, different breaches and different samples uploaded by networker. You can see here O2 Micro, another company was compromised with networker. University of Seattle, a good example where it was deployed on the networks, encrypted. There's Taylor Company, Invent US Power. Those are unique samples that were automatically decrypted. And the YARA played a key role across identifying unique sequences in the static unpacker and the content efforts that we have. And this is a key aspect of what we do. And the simple rule here can be as such: a crypto implementation here, searching for this condition across the samples. And we were able to be quite successful with that. And also there is a helpful blog that exists that's available for you to take a look and reference. And the idea, I want you to think about the YARA signaturing and how we use for hunting purposes. We use a combination always of signature and code reuse matches. And this is the key going forward, is just to use the YARA signature as the full Swiss Army knife for purposes that are suitable for your needs. And one of our full needs is just to create automation. The key aspect of everything we do is just to automate. A good saying is, if you ever do something twice, you have to automate it. And this is what we live by and breathe by. This is a good example of how the YARA can help you with identifying unique samples. At this time, I would like to run some key takeaways. Part of the talk is that we've seen through our landscape perspective and the way we work and the way the landscape is appearing, that we've seen that there is automation of malware and interactive human exploitations. We've seen that it's no longer fully automated spray and pray attacks that we've seen with, for example, low-key ransomware deployed, but it's also an attack where they use the pivots from the Trigbot malware, for example, to install a PowerShell Empire or Cobalt Strike that connection, and then using that infections to pivot and identify high-value targets. We've seen that the cybercrime actually meets APT, Advanced Persistent Threat Groups. We found exact evidence connection between the Trigbot banking malware group and the Lazarus financially motivated North Korean group. We found the exact command execution. We found that it's no longer enough to disregard simple cybercrime threats as low-value threats. We've seen that even dormant infection maturing more into APTs. We've seen that, for example, that Trigbot banking malware oftentimes is dormant for 2 weeks before the criminal operators return to networks to encrypt them. So it's very crucial for you to take a look at all indicators related to commodity malware that we are referencing. And as well as thinking about that, those infections can mature into full-blown data breach incidents. We also learned that the ransomware cases are no longer data disruption events. Ransomware breaches becoming really do breaches. They become data exfiltration events. And that changes the landscape. because it enables us to, essentially allows us to think about the breaches as the starting point, or ransomware cases can be a starting point of another data exfiltration, and looking for events related that will be very helpful when you're doing forensics. And also the hunting using YARA for malware developer cryptologic implementation is the key. Part of this session, we took a look into how TrickBot uses a custom RC4 S-box size implementation, and how you can write a very simple YARA signature that related to this S-box tracking, and using that signature to write an automated end-to-end unpacker or hunt in networks for artifacts related to the Trigbot Crypter. So that's super helpful and can be used in the future to identify new samples and even identify new malware, as we know that the crypter that Trigbot is using is shared across Emotet and Ryuk groups as well, which are all linked together through the human operation. But it's also very helpful for us to know that the YARA can be used for malware developer cryptologic searches. We also learned that the group behind network ransomware also can be easily tracked and unpacked and hunted for samples related to any additional samples that they might be deploying. For example, Networker has its own mini config configuration file that can be automatically unpacked, where the YARA plays a critical role both of finding the samples related to Networker, but also identifying routines and essential sequences within the malware itself that can be used to pivot and essentially use for decryption purposes. And hunting for human malware developers is the key as well. Through all the automation efforts we've seen, through all the habits we've seen as humans, we still repeat the same routines over and over. We still have the same ideas and focus, and we do not revise the same routines many times. So this is the key here going forward, is just to thinking about the code reuse and thinking about how we can use unique signatures, unique strings, combined with the code reuse logic to hunt for sophisticated samples. And this will be the key forward. It's whenever you think about the code reuse, thinking about the cryptography and how the cryptographical algorithms are employed, because that will be, or it is quite unique to some groups. And it will be another advantage over the criminal actors. And the key behind everything else, especially here, is, in my view, the perspective we've seen now. It's between cyber criminals and network defenders and hunters. It's a cat and mouse game. And to be ahead of the criminals and what they do is really to focus on the proactive mission of identifying the malware developer habits, identifying how they write different implementations in code. And using YARA is a perfect way for you to realize the full potential of that perspective. On this note, I would like to also offer you, specific for Reversing 2020, we have created a discount code. Feel free to take advantage of. We currently run a full course called Zero to Automated, and part of this course we offer you exclusively to enjoy the 10% discount, where we focus on YARA specifically in multiple examples. On this note, I would like to pass the microphone back to Rob, and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Vitali. We actually do. We have quite a few questions. So the first one is, what is your opinion on auto-generated YARA rules from various tools as compared to human-generated rules?
It's a great example. It's a great question. Thank you so much. In my view, I think the best tool in what I have, and kind of what we teach in some of the analysts, if we are looking to create long-lasting tools that exist through multiple samples, oftentimes they require a certain level of malware analysis. I do believe that certain automation can be done on the triage purposes, but full end-to-end automations of YARA signatures, in my view, it's not a 100% reliable way forward. And I think as a malware analyst and as a malware hunter, it's crucial for you to think about what would be the ideal way for you to design your own signatures. I think what we teach and we think, like with the perspective in mind, that we don't really care about tools, we care about the processes and thinking behind it. I think tools can be a helpful way to you to learn how the tools are generated, learning from the code of the tools and using that as a possible whitelist of some features you didn't know. But the key forward, I think, and growing as a network hunter and future is just to develop your own or find your own algorithm. Like for example, I have my own toolbox where I do a mix of automated malware, string matching, as well as my own, YARA writing habits. So I do combine both automations and my own human generation aspect as I move forward. But I do have a good hunch at this point which human generated aspects should work and which shouldn't. I think at scale it's more problematic to rely for only on human generated rules. But I think from the growing as a professional in the field where we are, it's crucial for you to develop your own habits to write it and write it quickly, especially relying on the first triage automations. So to sum up, I think the key aspect here is just to focus on automation in the beginning and then mixing automations and humanly generated rules in future.
Awesome. And we also have one request. If you could actually go back to your slide with the link for the course. There's been a request to have the link put back up. Yes. And then next question is the Maze leak site a static page or does it vary? And if it's static, can it be shared or is it something that can be monitored?
So Rob, can you repeat your question? I do apologize.
Yes, absolutely. The Maze information leak site from the Maze ransomware breaches, is that a static page or is it something that is, is it a variable page? Does it vary?
So in this case, so the Maze basically runs a custom WordPress site, where they use to upload different code samples. They do have various proxies that enable their activities even when some of the websites go down. So I think this is a static page in a way that it's presented, but it's been updated pretty regularly by quite a few ransomware hackers and who compromise affiliates rather of this group. So I would say static in regard of the information, but it's more, they have some redundancy across the site operation that enables them to survive certain even takedown requests, if I'm understanding the question correctly.
Great. Another question is, there's been mentioned that some threat actors have actually referred to you directly in their malware. Do you hunt for your own name in any of your in your hunting systems using YARA?
It's a great question. I do actually hunt for my own names, and we've seen lately that the Maze group itself loves using my name as a dynamically linked library files. So, and I do have my own signature, as my name appeared anywhere from APT 28 samples to Maze and Echo, Medusa, REvil, Artifacts. And it's kind of jokingly I say that there's, I think in some shape or form, criminals are like researchers. They like tracking us, what we do. So it enables us, another vector of my research is just to track my own mentions. But this is just a hobby, or rather than serious hunting efforts. But this just means that they acknowledge our research and they know who we are. But it's an interesting question. Thank you.
Next question is, where do you get the YARA, where do you develop your YARA signatures from? A packed sample or an unpacked sample? And if the sample is unpacked, what do you use to unpack it?
It's a great question. In many cases, actually, I believe in that some of the interesting and most sophisticated rules we've seen that are focused on the crypter layers. And this is a good, on our blog, actually, you can see here in the source page, where we focus on decrypting the Trigbot Crypter. And I think some of the, most complicated and some of the most interesting sample YARA signatures are related to the crypter layer. What I say by crypter layer, it's the packed samples. So if we can signature the packer, and if the packer is used exclusively by one group, it can yield us great benefits, as we can track any new samples uploaded by the malware group. And oftentimes, YARA actually can be more reliable than any antivirus detection, as we are focused on specific implementation within the packer. The idea behind some of the rules we've seen is just to focus on both. As much as possible, we try to analyze and write signatures related to packers, but also we write signatures related to unpacked samples as well. And because they're super helpful and they can be used to scan memory, for example, on the network machines. There are quite a few purposes and reasons why we signature unpacked samples. Oftentimes, it allows us additional opportunity to hunt for unknown samples in network environments or upload it anywhere. But also, it can be used for example, network or rather incident response work. So there's still a huge benefit of doing that. And the way to unpack a sample is we actually teach it quite a bit in our course, and we also can share kind of some of our ideas. Is just we have quite a few automation efforts as well that exist that can help you with that. There's quite a few scripts that are available in open source, including Hasherizade, some of the tools, and some other researchers that released. I think the idea is also to focus on identifying how you can unpack it yourself. The big win for us, just for you from the analyst side, network defender, is just to not focus on tooling, but rather identify how you can dump the malware yourself, for example, unpacked, fix for example, rebase the malware sample and just use it for analysis. And the key there is just to rely on tools as much as it's a crutch for you in your normal activities, but also thinking about the logic behind what you do. So we do use both automations and then the manual efforts as well. And I think it's combinations of two is the most reliable to unpack almost every sample or any commercial packer that exists in the wild.
Great. Next question is, how can we attribute a particular sample or campaign, and how can you be sure about that? And should we consider geopolitical aspects in order to make it more accurate?
It's a great question. I think this question kind of needs more context. In some shape or form, we do try to attribute some threats to understand what's the perspective and kind of what can be who the adversary is. I think the key when we are thinking about our methodology behind the tracking and everything else is just that there is no target that it's safe. We know that the criminals pursue not only financial institutions but any other targets. There's a built-in profile of the organization identifying what are the current targets and attackers, who the attackers are. It's crucial. The geopolitical aspect is important in future, especially with advanced hunting efforts. Whenever you have hunters who have to be parsing networks for a longer period of time, searching for unique artifacts. So staying on top of the latest trends is critical of the APT world. But from the first level analysis, I think it's crucial to achieve full mitigation of the threat in the first place. Then second of all, analyze trending related to the samples and try to build a hypothesis related to the attacker's profile or adversarial perspective. And then C is that, of course, taking into account the possible geopolitical tensions, and if it's a diplomatic organization that might be interested to the foreign adversaries, there's a huge chance that it might be targeted by the government hackers, as we call them, or nation-state groups. So there's always critical to think and have that perspective from the intelligence side. But the very first step you need to be doing is just to defend the network and then build a profile. I think it's combinations of two is going to be critical. And as you build skills and analysis and some perspective, you can clearly identify samples quickly. And the beauty of our information security community is that we have the world of Twitter, for example, where the researchers can help you identify samples quickly. And feel free to ping us, myself included, to see if we can help you to identify samples if it's unknown. So there's always a thriving and very helpful community that exists surrounding the attributions of threats, which can also help you as well. So in short, I think it's critical for you to identify threats as a next step, but in the very first action is just to defend the networks.
Thanks. Next question is, do you have a system for testing the quality of your YARA rules?
It's a great question. Yes, I do. The system should have a plethora of bad, samples and bad and goodware. So oftentimes it's almost what becomes critical in future is just to run your YARA signatures across a large pool of known badness and known goodness, if it makes sense. So to run across the samples that are known to be benign, and run across the samples that are known to be malicious. So it's always critical to review and analyze samples if there is a possible false positive that exists. It's critical to for example, there is quite a few good resources, including Virus Share, where you can, for example, download over 10 terabytes of malware samples. There's additional, Microsoft also allows you multiple virtual machines, and you can parse, for example, Microsoft artifacts and whitelist them in some shape or form. So it's critical to maintain the integrity of the YARA signatures. But really, the YARA signatures, in my view, it's a Swiss Army knife, depending on what your end goal is. That with the signatures, because signatures for hunting can be very different from signatures from, for example, network defense. So there's a wide and rich applications. From the hunting perspective, there's a repetitive cycle of you testing the rule, testing for false positive, testing for false negatives, and then continuously and in a cycle repeating the same tasks. So it's critical for you to maintain a sort of like a data lake with the known samples and test them out. Quite a few researchers maintain their own big repositories of such tools, and can be quite helpful in you to vet and identify if your rule set works as needed. So there's, again, I do have my own, and I can help you with that. Of course, please feel free to ping me as well.
All right, I think this will be the last question. So how do you identify encryption algorithms in ransomware?
It's an excellent question. There's quite a few ransomware. There's quite a few interesting, helpful plugins that exist. Even if you're a fan of, for example, interactive disassembler IDA, there's a Fine Crypto plugin. There's additional plugins that exist. For example, one of my favorite ones is the Canal plugin that can be used from another PE file. There's quite a few automated plugins that can help you find both the constants related to cryptographical algorithms, as well as the unique implementations and artifacts. So we, as part of our course, we actually teach how to identify unique encryptions and even hashing and compression algorithms. There are three things you need to be identifying in any malware that you're looking into and try to signature if they're custom. It's the encryption aspect in ransomware, for example, what the algorithm is. And then, for example, AES and RSA have very unique constants that you can use to at least take a look at them. Then B is to identify what the hashing algorithms are, if it's using the MD5, SHA-1, or anything else to, for example, build a bot ID, which is quite common across the malware samples. And the compression. Compression is also super helpful because LZ compression, for example, used in TrickBot quite a bit. And there's quite a few tools that you can use to automatically take a look at the constants, because nobody remembers all the constants in the world of that. So I always run through Canal plugin or additional tools that exist. There's also quite helpful YARA repository that exists that can search for cryptographic implementations across files. Just focusing on the constants and focusing on the unique sequences of code that can be useful for that. But as you grow as an analyst, as you grow as a malware researcher, it's also important for you to essentially, I believe in the reverse engineering, where you need to write your own cryptographical function yourself, debug it yourself, see how it's implemented in code, see how it looks as you code it, for example, in C, and look at code RSA in C, and take a look at the RSA in debugger, see if it makes sense, and try to build an eye and kind of like build your skills analyzing the scene, identifying those quicker. So I think there's a very interesting road forward for you to take a look into both the constants using automation tools, and then B is just to try to code it yourself and take a look at the debugger and see if you can identify it going next and repeat it. I think this is the key forward.
Well, thank you, Vitali. Thank you very much.